The other thing Sasha went through is manner, matter, and method. Those are things that you are scored on in debating in 3-on-3. Manner is the way you present your case, so say your tone, your hand movements, the way you stand, those kind of things. Matter is what you actually say, so the content of your speech and the specific information you're providing. And method is how you structured your speech. So if it was really easy to follow, if you had a logical flow, those kind of things. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take your debating to the next level and go through 3 main areas. Creating a case, so looking at the types of models that you can use as the affirmative, going through first principles and making arguments from first principles, and then just some general tactics that can be useful for debates. I will say all of this is stolen from Tim Steinrach's guide, which is on the website, but unless you've actually had someone explain it to you, a lot of it's kind of gibberish. So, also, I don't know who Sway is or what level up is. I just typed it into Google and it came up, so it looked like it was going to be useful. So, before I start, is there any questions about anything? Good. Solid. Alright, so creating a case. So obviously, as the affirmative team, as you would know, you have to set up a definition. You'll get a specific topic and you need to actually establish the debate and the context for the debate to occur in that both sides can actually engage in. And when you're on the affirmative team and you're in your prep time, the 2 things you really need to keep in mind are the context and the spirit of the motion. And so what I want to do is I want to actually just explain these 2 things using this example. Well, actually, I'll explain it generally. So the context is what has happened recently in the world that might mean this debate has to happen, or might mean that this particular proposal in the debate has to happen. The spirit of the motion is about what you think, or what is fairly going to be, should have been set in that topic. So, for example, if it was talking about banning drugs, you're probably not going to go to some specific ancient Eastern medicine that was used up until like the 1600s, and that's what you're going to talk about, right? So, for example, if you were talking about a debate where we would intervene, or that the UN should intervene in some specific country, what countries might you want to talk about? Where is there civil conflict in the world? Syria. Who's killing who? Yep.
Whatever else said, Syria.
Syria, yep. Are there other, what historically in the last decade?
Israel.
Yeah. That'd be an interesting question. Yeah. Yep. So you've got some context, right? There are, if a debate topic is set, there's usually a reason to set it, and importantly, you have to think about what the context is. The spirit of the motion is also important. So, for example, if you had that this House supports a 2-state solution, what do you think is the fairest area to set it to? I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's probably Israel-Palestine, right? It's probably going to be that conflict that's in the news a lot, that most people might have an understanding of, and that it could actually have a fair debate for both sides, right? An example where you set a definition that wouldn't be in the spirit of the motion is if you say you're talking a 2-state solution in areas between, say, Azerbaijan and Armenia, right? You know, where there's just conflict, but most people probably don't know about it, right? Most people aren't going to have an understanding, even at a basic level, of conflicts around that region. So spirit of the motion is actually setting up in a way that is fair, and actually leads to a decent debate.
And to be fair, most of the spirit of the motion stuff only comes into practice when you have a pretty vague or broad topic. And for you guys, most of you, if you're going to Easters, the topics are fairly specific. They won't let you struggle along with something like the 2-state solution right off the bat. So it's something to keep in mind, but it won't be a pressing issue for you guys to...
Yeah, so another example where, okay, well, I'll throw an example out. So if you had the topic, and this probably would be a Dow topic, but that we have spent too much money on the stars, what could you define that as? Fairly. Someone, yell out. Anyone. Yep.
Exorbitant space program.
Yep. What's another definition?
Celebrity culture.
Yep, celebrity culture, tabloids. You know, what do you think either of those are fair? What's more realistically going to make for a good debate?
Space.
Probably space. Probably that and before NASA was guided by the government. Probably that there was a lot of money wasted on going to outer space with no real benefit, right? So again, that just looks at what do you think is going to be the fairest debate if you have an ambiguous topic. All right. So But when you've created what you know the context is going to be, what the spirit of the motion should be about, you've got to, as the affirmative team, you've got to work out what kind of case you want to run, what kind of line do you want to set. What that means is you have an option to make a massive change to the status quo or a small change to the status quo.
Is everyone clear what the status quo actually is?
It's a term that gets thrown around. It basically means the current state of things.
Very good.
I don't actually know the Latin exactly. So, if you have the topic down the bottom, so yeah, you can choose to make a big change, you can choose to make a small change. And what you need to think about is what is actually going to be easiest for your team to prove and what's going to be fair. So for example, if you had the topic at the bottom that this house supports euthanasia, a hardline change, or a big change, would be that we have we have free and open access to euthanasia. We're not going to put any restrictions on it, maybe just some, an exam by a psychologist, but it won't be that stringent, right? That would be a significant shift from the status quo, which implied by the topic would be we don't have euthanasia, right? It's a massive change and a massive step forward. On the other hand, what do you guys think would be a soft line? What would be a small change from the status quo that you could use in the euthanasia debate that wasn't, say, just open access for everyone to be able to end their own life?
Allowing euthanasia for the terminally ill.
Yeah. Allowing euthanasia for those who are already going to die. So what that would actually do is it would say there are a specific but small group of people that should have access to euthanasia. What of those two options, open and really easy access to euthanasia or just access to euthanasia for the terminally ill, what do you reckon would be easier to support, just logically? There's no right or wrong answer for this.
Terminally ill.
Terminally ill? Okay. If you were talking about the terminally ill then, why should someone who is dying from cancer have access to euthanasia as opposed to someone who might suffer from severe dementia and is losing everything that is unique about them, but it may not necessarily kill them? Is there a massive distinction between those two people where one person's life will end, but another person's life will be so awful for them that they might want to end it? It may not end, but it will be abhorrent. Do you think that that's kind of a hard distinction to draw? Or could be a hard distinction to draw in a debate?
Yeah.
Or even someone who might be in a coma, right, and may not have any chance of getting out of that. They may not die, but they might have an awful quality of life. The interesting thing to note about whether or not you run a hard line, a really big change, or a strong change versus running a soft line is actually a lot of the time it's easier to run a hard line, right? Because what you're doing is making such a big shift from the norm, from the status quo, that the distinctions and the reasoning behind it are they're principally easier to justify. So if you're doing the euthanasia one, you might say, we're allowing open access to euthanasia because we realise that for the majority of people, they want the ability to control how they die, right? You have the ability to control all aspects of your life before that. Why not have the ability to control your death? It shouldn't matter necessarily on your circumstances, whether or not you're terminally ill, whether or not your body is failing you, whether or not you have a chronic, a severe mental illness, right? Shouldn't matter. You should have access to that, right? Yeah.
So the thing about running a hardline case is obviously inherently you make fewer concessions. When you run a softer case, often it's quite easy to do that, but you've got to remember that every time if you try to argue a big principle, you say, we think that this particular principle is really important, except in this scenario, and this scenario here, where we would allow or not allow certain things to happen. So every time you make a concession, you weaken the big principle thing that you stand behind, and it makes it much easier for your opposition to say, well, given you've undermined that principle, 4 or 5 times, it's not that important actually. We don't think that it's we think you've conceded that it's not a very big deal, and then they go on a rampage about how the harms and so on are dreadful and all that.
Yeah. So for example, in a different example, what would be a hard line for that we would legalise drugs debate? Hard line, big change.
Everyone should have access to drugs.
Yeah, so you could have a proactive right where the government can provide it. What else? Maybe, as in provide, they might sell it, the government's a drug dealer. What else might be part of the hardline model?
All forms of drugs are allowed.
Yeah, all forms of drugs, right? And to the other side, what could be a also viable soft line that you might run?
Decriminalising usage.
Decriminalise usage, yeah. So not making it legal, but just not making it illegal, and that kind of yeah. So as in you won't get punched.
Medical marijuana.
Yeah, medical marijuana. You could as a soft line, you could say, and it's not necessarily less legitimate, but you could say that marijuana accounts possession there's nothing wrong with it. It's not such a harmful drug. It's not like crystal meth. We're not saying that you shouldn't be allowed to do it. We just think that there are so many people that do. Maybe it's a good idea that we make it legal. So it's up to you what you think is going to be the best for your team and what will make for the fairest debate as well in general. Because these are the things that the adjudicator will look for and that will make your life easier when you're creating your case. So yeah, this is just the kind of going back to the euthanasia debate. You know, soft line, very, very, very sick people. Hard line, you know, basically quite open. So that's what the affirmative team does, right? You run a line. You've got an option of running a soft line or a hard line. The negative team has a couple of options. What you can do when you hear the proposal of the affirmative is you can say choose to support the status quo, which is you don't think there needs to be a change. You think what's happening right now is either good or maybe it's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative. What you can also do is run a counter model, right? So what you could say is we recognise that the status quo is actually really, really bad. We agree with the affirmative on that point, but there is a better way to solve that problem than what they have suggested. So there are two options here. Can you guys think of some advantages or disadvantages of, say, just going with the status quo, just going with what happens at the moment, saying that there isn't a problem?
It's really like clear-cut the structure of the status quo.
Yep. Yeah. You also have a lot of evidence to draw from as to why the status quo already exists, right? Because if the change hasn't occurred already, there's probably a good reason for it.
Maybe.
Yeah, well, otherwise all government is inefficient and we've never heard that before. What about putting up, say, a counter model, right? So what would be a good, what are a good reason for putting up something completely different that actually, you know, changes the same problem as what the affirmative team identified?
It's much harder to rebut.
It's not necessarily harder to rebut because they can still point out flaws in what you've said, but there is an issue with the rebuttal that kind of comes from the affirmative, and they can't actually rebut it on the same grounds as what they normally would rebut the status quo, right? Because you've accepted the same premise. They can't say the premise is wrong. They have to, specifically attack your model. It depends on how good your model is, whether or not it's actually harder. One of the best advantages of a counter model, though, from the negative, if you're the first negative speaker and you get up and you accept the problem and you make a new model, is that a lot of what the first person said on the affirmative team is useless, right? Because most of the time they will spend half their speech or something around that point establishing why there was a need for a change and then showing why what they proposed was best. If you accept that the change is needed, it's half their speech gone. It's irrelevant from the debate because both teams are accepting the same thing. Then you can actually spend the majority of your speech and get on the front foot and say, yes, there's a problem, but here's why our solution is actually better. And you dedicate more time to your solution than they did at the start, and it puts you on the front foot. What might be a disadvantage, though, of running a counter model? And it's kind of the opposite of that idea. Yeah.
It's either never been tested and hence may not be seen as realistic.
Yeah, it could be something quite new, and you have to actually run it against what as a normal change usually from affirmative teams. It also just makes it harder, for you to show why the affirmative team's model is actually not going to work. Because if there is if it's a logical model and there is a problem, then chances are that's a model that's been discussed a lot. If that's say in the media, in societies in general, it's harder to prove why it won't cause a change, why the affirmative team won't meet their burden, if you're accepting the premises under which they've established their model. So, this topic was at Easter's last year. what do you guys, so if the affirmative team get up and say, the affirmative team get up and say that America, I misspelled it in the thing and I just copied it right. America should not commit drone attacks in Pakistan without Pakistan's permission. I take it we all know about drones, the robots that will eventually destroy us all. Good. What could you reasonably choose to run from the negative team?
There are seats, guys, everywhere.
Yeah.
You don't have to feel like you have to sort of hide up in the corner.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, except for the team.
What could the negative team run on this particular topic?
For example, if the Pakistani government is forewarned about drone attacks, they will leak it to the ISI, who will leak it to the GRs.
Yep, so don't tell Pakistan at all.
Yeah.
Just keep doing what America was doing and just make drone attacks without Pakistan's permission. Yep, that's one option. Yep.
Contact the president directly without going through the Pakistani intelligence services.
Yeah, so making it a change of how you contact people, although I guess that would depend on what the affirmative team set up as, you know, telling Pakistan. But yeah, no, that could work. Yeah.
And it's not like as well, you're carrying out a military action in someone else's territory against people arguable subjects of that country.
Yep, so yeah, no more drone attacks at all.
Because it's basically going to all the Pakistan.
Yeah. And even more, if you wanted to go even more extreme, you could say that, you know, maybe America should stop using drone attacks altogether, right? So that, because there are a number of ways you could actually, and that was if you're going from a moral standpoint about drones, but the point is there are a number of ways you could approach it. You could go for continue using lots and lots of drone attacks because they're really effective, or you could say no more drone attacks in Pakistan because at all, even with permission, because drone attacks in a friendly country's territory is obscene and we don't want to stand by it. So you could take it from two different perspectives, and there are two different ways to approach it. Are there any questions so far? Alright, so this is just generally looking at, and we've kind of covered this, hardlines are often easier to back up because there's such a massive change, but they also have a large number of problems that are associated with them, whereas soft lines a bit more nuanced. It's a bit easier to prove why, it's a bit easier, less of a change necessarily from the status quo, but it's a bit hard to prove because there are issues with consistency and there's always like a spectrum of things that you need to deal with. Cool. That was establishing a case, going from a hard line to a soft line, looking at what the negative team can do as well. What I'm going to look at now is something called first principles, and it's a style of creating arguments that Monash has used for many, many years. The guy that created this, the document this is based on, finished uni in I think like 1997. So it's been going for a while, and it's worked for Monash for a very long time. And the idea of first principles is that it's a matter of using, say on the next slide, it's a matter of using logic and using context to actually create arguments, even when you may not know heaps about a specific topic. And we've all been in a room, a debating room, and you will be in debating rooms in the future, where you walk in and you may not have much idea about what the topic was about. This is a way of actually creating arguments that are based on specific principles that exist across a number of debates. So, last week, in Sasha's presentation, she gave you the way you construct an argument. It starts with an idea, it moves down to analysis, and then you add evidence. And those three things combined is what an argument is. It's not just an idea and analysis and evidence, or one of them. It's all three together. So for example, the idea might be, if we were banning smoking, right? The idea might be the government should step in to protect people when they are self-harming. The analysis could be smoking is incredibly damaging to all of these things to your body. You can't make a rational choice because the nicotine affects your mental processing and your consent is thus vitiated. And then the evidence just might be statistics that you might be able to pull out of the age or some specific evidence-based institution, right? But the idea of going from the idea, what the government should do, to the reasons why the government should do it is the important part about making arguments. I just wanted to recap on it. So, first principles is about going from basic theories of logic. That's not to say you should go out and do a philosophy course on logic, although I love logic and it's a great idea. But it's just about using common sense and keep asking the right questions, and you can actually create arguments even when you don't know a lot about a specific topic. It also involves understanding the central clash in a debate. And what that means is, whenever there's a debate topic set, there has to be two sides, obviously, to each, to the debate, and the people who write debate topics are very aware that they want both sides to have enough material to have a debate that's worth watching, because generally they're going to be the ones watching it. They don't want to be bored for an hour. When you're dealing with the clash, it means that there are principles on either side that both teams can argue from, right? It's like saying when you have general political parties, you have a left-wing party and a right-wing party, right? The left-wing party has a certain set of principles that they argue from. The right-wing party has a certain set of principles that they argue from. They're different underlying perspectives on the same issues that can inform what you are arguing about. So, let's say we had this topic, right? That we would require the ordination of female and homosexual priests, reverends, blah, 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 in whatever particular religions. Basically saying that we wouldn't allow religions to restrict who can run for positions of power within their religion. This was in Easter's 2010, which was in Melbourne. Alright? What do you guys think the clash of the debate here is? What do you think the major principles that are at odds with each other from the affirmative team and the negative team are in this debate? Yep.
Equality versus individual right.
Individual right as in?
As in the right for, so as in like the right, sorry, religious right versus like individual right.
Yeah. Yeah, that the government should actively promote equality, that it should try and root out equality, versus the idea that institutions that are private, that are, have their own specific ways of doing things, should be allowed to remain that way, and the government shouldn't intrude on those institutions. So if that's the central clash, let's say the affirmative team is arguing that the government should step in to promote equality, what are some arguments that you might want to make? Just not even if you didn't know anything about statistics of to women being denied access to the church, position of power, or which religions use it, or whatever. Just from the affirmative, just from the idea of equality and the government stepping in, what are some general ideas that you could run with?
State versus religion.
State versus religion?
Like,
How
how
so?
much power should each have over the other?
Okay, yeah. So the idea, the idea of secularism, how much power do we afford to the government? How much power do we afford to individual religions, right? So how would you make that into an argument? That's an idea. How would you make it into an argument? To put you on the spot.
Maybe analyze past events, see how they turn out.
You could. But if you're arguing from the idea of equality, you have some principles underlying that argument that you could argue from, right? So if you're saying that the government, there should be more intervention by the government in religion, we support rooting out equality. The way you might make that argument is to say it's important that the government is active in rooting out equality, that the government is seen to be saying to all people across society, no matter who you are, that you should treat others respectfully, that everyone is equal, that there shouldn't be allowed, that this institutional inequality shouldn't be allowed to continue. On the other hand, if you're saying that the government shouldn't step in, that religions should be allowed to hold on to the traditions that they have, what do you guys think might be an argument or an idea on that side? Yes?
It's not a matter of state because it's not any legislation as to whether women can become priests or whatever. That's something which religion determines for itself. So the government essentially has nothing to say because they go, okay, look, you can have your religion. And we won't force people to believe in it, you won't force people to believe in it, but if people believe in it, they'll abide by your rules if they want to.
Yeah. And also, yeah.
Well, you could say it defeats the purpose of having a religious organisation. They can't follow their own rules and wear their own special hats.
Yeah, they might. What's the point of having a set of traditions that the idea of religion being doesn't change over time if the government's going to come in and basically force you to change something? Yeah.
Religion is a deeply personal thing that the government can't prescribe to other people because they can't understand it, and by removing that is very important individual freedom.
Yeah. One of the ideas that's often brought up in debates is the government's very bad at deciding for people or telling people what's going to be good for them to live their life, right? So maybe the government generally should step out, and that's another principle you could stand for in the negative. Less government intervention, generally speaking, because you think the government's just bad at doing this. Yep.
On a fundamental level, religions are about telling people who follow them how they can best live their lives. And the government, it's not the government's job to step in and say, this is how you should live their lives. It's replacing that role of religion. It's inherently incompatible what they're doing.
Yeah, so these are all ideas that just draw from the basis of the clash, that the government is should step out, should stay out of these kind of affairs. That the government doesn't know what's best for religious people, and that religions have certain principles, certain traditions that they stand by, and that's how they actually best operate as religions. So, looking at, say, general principle clashes that often occur in debates, and these are things that you should keep an eye out for depending on what the topic is, because oftentimes they'll happen. The idea of big or small government, do you guys know what that is? Can someone give me an idea of what big government and small government is?
Socialism versus like having a tiny run system that the government only takes a little bit of tax and only does a little bit in society.
Yeah, the idea that the government is involved heavily or the government isn't involved. So,
I just wanted to suggest that it's where the government tries to give people the maximum amount of freedom, so tries to stay out of everyone's lives and tries not to get involved in as much as they can. So it's often linked to free market ideas. That sort of stuff.
Yeah. And so the religion debate we just talked about then is a good example of where you might want the government to be smaller, you might want them to step back, or you might want them to be bigger, you might want to actually involve them in these kind of issues. Economic policy, this is a classic one that gets thrown around, both in politics in general, by economists who never really know what they're talking about, and in debates where most debaters really know what they're talking about as well. The idea of having a free market versus having a regulated market, right? So that if there is an issue in the market, if you believe that the free market is better, you might say the market will have mechanisms to sort that out. That the market can fix itself, generally can fix itself, and the government doesn't need to step in. On the other hand, you might say, well, no, the market's really bad at fixing itself. The government needs to step in to ensure that the problem doesn't persist, the problem doesn't repeat itself. In terms of environmental regulation, what do you guys think about what might be the market or the government idea of environmental regulation? What does the government have to do? And if you believed in the government solving these problems, what would you say?
The government providing incentives for more environmentally friendly type things.
Yeah, the government proposing more and more regulation. What do you guys think might be the other side? Let's say we're talking about whether or not we would have a carbon tax, right? One side wants a carbon tax. On the other hand, you want to oppose it. Why might you think that, say, government regulation is not going to work? What might be an alternative to that? This is a trickier question, I know.
Yeah, trading scheme.
Trading scheme? In a sense, that's still a government and in fact, intergovernmental often policy. Is there a non-governmental policy that might fix it? No? Yeah?
So like getting the industry to regulate itself, because especially with environmental, industry and the market is affected by the consumer's demands. So obviously, as people learn more about the environmental problems, there's going to be a higher demand for green energy and things that are produced without the consumption of so much carbon. And the industry is going to have to recognise that and adapt, and they would be best suited to do that.
Yeah, exactly. If the people really want something, a solution to carbon being emitted in large quantities into the atmosphere, then theoretically the market will see that demand and adapt. They will create technologies like, say, cars, the low emission, they'll create technologies to capture carbon, those kind of things. So in that sense, the government doesn't actually need to do anything. The technology will adapt based on the incentives for the market. And the government doesn't need to step in, and if the government did, maybe it harms those incentives, maybe it does it wrong. So that's a potential market option. International intervention, you could have, generally speaking, let's go in, let's intervene. That could take multiple forms, but you're basically going in. You could also have the don't intervene, right? And that could take two levels. That could be, we don't want to intervene here, because if we intervene, there's going to be a lot more bloodshed. Think the US going into Somalia, maybe that didn't really work. Or you could say that, generally speaking, countries shouldn't intervene in the affairs of other countries, right? If there's a civil conflict, that is if it was a legitimate civil opposition and things like that. There might be certain circumstances where civil conflict is actually still maintains sovereignty. So any other country doesn't have the right to go in and actually involve itself in that conflict. Basically, the idea of first principles is realizing that every single topic will have specific common themes that you can actually translate across topics, right? Whether or not it's the role of government, whether or not it's the type of way you view economic policy or environmental policy, things like that. And first principles is about recognizing what each side is going to argue and drawing your arguments from that using the principles of logic. What will lead to what? Why will that be better? Are there any questions on that? It's a lot to take in, but it'll come with a bit of time once you realize that there are similar themes that run through each topic. You can also structure your rebuttal through the first principles idea, through the lens of first principles. What you'll find a lot is that these five ideas will be repeated often in debates. People will say that you're making an assertion, and people will say it's a false dichotomy so often, and eventually it'll be numbing your brain and you won't actually know. A lot of people don't actually know what they mean. So, the first one is assertion, right? What is the logical problem with an assertion? What is an assertion? Does anyone know what an assertion is? Yep.
It's like basically just a statement that lacks evidence. In like the case of an argument, like it's just a blanket statement, kind of generalization, I guess.
Yep. So you might say, say we would legalize drugs debate, and you are for the team legalizing drugs. Your opposition responds by saying, no, but if you legalize drugs, more people will use drugs. That's an assertion. They haven't backed it up. They haven't said why more people will use drugs. They just assumed that because it's being legalized, and this happens a lot, they haven't analyzed it. They just assumed that it will happen. That's an assertion. There's no logical conclusion as to why that's true. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's not. They haven't backed it up. So you need to keep an eye out for that. When people aren't doing the analysis, when they're not providing the evidence, when they're not going through that structure of an argument that we showed before, that's when they're making an assertion, and you can call it on that.
Assertions also sneak up on people when they are the basis for arguments. So, for example, in a lot of social welfare debates, people often make a lot of assertions about who receives welfare. They say it's all poor people, it's all single mothers, and it's all Aboriginal people, which aren't actually true. But then they use that to like springboard into an argument about those individuals. And so it's often like a sneaky way for these people to get like a good argument without actually basing it in any reality. So instead of attacking the argument, it's much more sensible to say, well, actually, like the grounds for which this argument is based is an assertion, and therefore like the rest of it logically falls.
Yeah.
So when the opposition makes a claim and they don't back it up, can you just explicitly say the opposition haven't adequately explained why this is the case, or should you just question it a little bit more subtly?
Yeah, you can. You want to do it in a way that isn't cruel. So you don't want to say they are completely crap. But the best thing that you can do, and we'll get to that later, is actually say they didn't show why it was true, and here's why it's not true, right? And actually do the work for them, and actually step through what their assertion was and show why it wouldn't work in their favour. Interestingly, with assertions, there's a lot of the times if we go back to the idea of the clash of the principles underlying each debate, again, the assertions might go to those principles. So their argument might be based on the assertion that government should be bigger. And they may not have justified why more government involvement is actually a good thing, or principally that more government involvement is a good thing. But they might have just assumed it. And you can actually say, well, no, it's an assertion that the government should always involve itself in specific issues. We actually believe the opposite. Contradictions, that's fairly explanatory. It's where teams have two statements, not usually in the same argument, but sometimes they do, it's quite hilarious. But when they have two statements that just can't stand together, that they just can't have in the same issue. So for example, if we went back to the drugs debate, you had an opposition that said that we wanted to legalise. Sorry, if you were legalising drugs and you said, when we legalise drugs, there will be less. Drugs will be cheaper. People will have to resort to say crime less because they can afford the drugs they need that they're already addicted to, right? But it's also difficult to say that people won't be able to access them as easily because there'll be education campaigns that will be inhibitive because you've reduced the cost. Because the idea that it's easier to access and it's more free to access doesn't necessarily stand. So there are contradictions in these kind of issues. So that's something to keep an eye out for. Casual causation. I think I'm going to look at this example. I'm just going to get rid of this and share. Yeah, good. So casual causation is the idea that if you, there we go. Yeah, the classic one. It's where people assume something to be true when it's not necessarily true. When there might be a correlation but not actual causation. And if anyone does a stats unit at some point, that'll be hammered home to you. So the example will be, that I wrote down, was that when you heard about the gun rights debate that occurred last year, and people on both sides are just yammering at each other and not really explaining anything. One of the lines that catch cries from, say, Republicans would be, in America, would be, if more people are armed, there'll be less deaths because there'll be more of a deterrence factor, right? Doesn't necessarily make sense. If more people are armed, they're more protected. They can, say, take out a shooter earlier. There'll be less civilian casualties. And there are some statistics where countries with higher gun ownership actually have lower death rates than, say, even higher gun ownership in America have lower death rates than America does. But the idea that more gun ownership, more free access to guns and ammunition caused that doesn't hold up, because there's no way to prove that necessarily happens. There's no way to prove that increased access to guns necessarily reduced the murder rate. You might say that it was because there was less of a culture of violence, or because people were more educated about their gun, how they use their guns, or maybe because the idea that they keep them guns at home just for protection as opposed to carrying them around everywhere. There could be other reasons why that particular result of a lower murder rate was caused, not necessarily by the one that just happened to be correlated with the incident in some circumstances, right? So what you need to look out for if someone's using causal causation is if they say this thing led to another when they haven't actually shown why it led to the thing they were talking about. A false dichotomy, the fourth one, is where a team will set up two competing realities which isn't necessarily fair. When they say, when they create a situation which isn't necessarily, I can't actually think of one. I've got one. Yeah, good.
So a really classic one is in intervention debates or assassination debates where people say, currently thousands of people being slaughtered by their leader. So the choice we have in this debate is either we go and save these people from destruction, and we go in with troops and we solve the problem, or we leave these people to die. And that's a pretty simplistic way of looking at things, right? But they say that there are only two options, and one of them is really, really bad, so we will pick, obviously, the really good one. And if you're on the opposition team, it's really hard for you to be like, well, actually, we opt for the slaughter of thousands of people. Like, we think that's a fantastic idea. So what you do is you actually say, there's not actually two options. There are a multitude of options that range from, like, A to Z, and this is how we'd actually do this. And you challenge them on the fact that there's only, like, a narrow possibility of outcomes.
Yeah, oh, actually, I did have. It'd be also similar, like in the abortion debate, right? If you got up and if your opposition got up and was legalizing abortion, it's not really right for you to say, well, our opposition hates all infants, hates all babies, and must want to kill all children everywhere, right? Because the opposition could say we're legalizing it for the normal reasons, because it's on balance, it's better. Maybe we don't necessarily like it, but it's better to have it legal and open than it is to necessarily ban it. So a false dichotomy is the concept where your opposition basically says, we'll support our option, or something completely batshit insane. You don't actually have to take that batshit insane option, or you can if you really want to. But you can actually say, no, what's realistic in this debate is, say, we intervene and we take out Assad in Syria, or we put sanctions on, because that's not involving like troops. Maybe that's a different way to solve the problem. So you don't have to listen to what they say.
To be fair though, at the same time, setting up a dichotomy is also good if you can, but just not one that's completely mad.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Has anyone got the sheets that were handed around? Anyone got a copy of those?
Just wipe them out. Yep.
Yeah, like this, okay. And the final one is straw man. So this is an interesting one where what the opposition will do is they'll take your case and they'll portray it in a way that's not actually accurate, and they'll try and attack it in that kind of way. They'll attack what they think your case should be when it's not what your case actually is. When they've set it up and they're trying to represent what you said completely differently to how you actually said it. Again, my brain's failing me. So for example, if you were looking at intervening in Syria debate, right? A straw man might be to say, our opposition want to send every single, like all US, all NATO troops into Syria. They want to send hundreds, if not thousands of troops into all capitals. They're going to have heavy bombing campaigns. They're not going to care about civilians. We're going to establish a situation, where like there's going to be high civilian casualties, right? And attack you on, well, you're going to take lots of civilian casualties. There's going to be a lot of people dead. Why are you allowing that? What you're doing is actually saying, here's what we think the opposition case is going to be, and we're going to attack you on that. When in reality, it might be slightly different. They might have instituted a no-fly zone. They might have only had a few troops on the ground, or maybe peacekeepers that aren't authorized to shoot, you know, or just to fire on if attacked. So it's really important to keep an eye on what your opponent's case actually is, so that you're not accused of having a straw man, of basically setting up a straw man.
There's nothing more frustrating than having your case hijacked by the opposition bench, who may or may not be a bunch of lunatics, and then they just go to town on this thing that they've invented. And you just want to stand there and be like, this is not what we stand for. Like, we've never said any of these things, you're completely insane. Like, stop doing this. So the converse of that, right, is that you have to be really careful that you don't do that to them. Because you might hear one word as you're writing your speech or your rebuttal, and you think, ah, great, like they've said this buzzword, which in my mind equals this, and you go on a rant about that. Turns out they've used that word in a completely different context. You've wasted 3 minutes of your speech, the adjudicator thinks you're a moron, and your opposition team hates your guts, right? So you just got to be really careful, because a lot of people don't do it on purpose, but they're busy writing things, thinking other stuff, they hear buzzwords, and they just sort of run with it. So that's like, beware.
Cool. This is the final thing about rebutting from first principles. So we talked about the clash, we talked about principles of logic, we've talked about logical flaws in arguments. That even if rebuttal is actually probably the most powerful rebuttal technique that you can use, and I recommend doing it for pretty much every rebuttal point that you have, unless something is so drastically unrealistic that you don't need to do it. That even if argument is basically saying, alright, we've listed a number of reasons why what you said is not going to work, why it's not going to happen, why it's not a good thing. But okay, let's say it does happen. Even if it does happen, here's why the situation you predicted, why your model is going to be worse than our model, why your outcome is going to be worse than our outcome, right? So if you're going to say, let's take, again, we'll run with the theme of the intervention debate, right? You could say, here are a number of reasons why intervention won't work, why you can't take out the Assad regime in Syria with intervention, because they're bunkered down, the conflict on the ground will be too difficult, you don't have the resources, you don't have the political will. You might say, even if we accept that you could eventually remove Assad, even if your model worked in the way you said it would, that ultimately the outcome of what you got is not acceptable, because you'll kill so many civilians doing so, because you might leave a power vacuum at the end of that won't be filled and will just lead to more conflict. That ultimately you're going to destroy so much infrastructure on the ground that the country will be plagued by civil conflict in the future because people's needs aren't being met and because people can't fend for themselves and things like that. So the even if argument is the idea that you accept the premise of what they've said, but you refute the outcomes. And by doing that, you actually show that even if we accepted things that they were saying, the way they said they would affect the debate wouldn't work. Yeah.
You say that even if it's a form of rebuttal, but what you were saying sounded a lot like a positive argument the negative might make in that debate. Could you have the first speaker stand up and say something, and then the second speaker say, we don't think Assad will fall based on their model, but even if it did fall, these are positive arguments why invading is a bad thing?
Well, yeah, you can actually turn them into positive arguments. The important thing is...
Most of them will be positive arguments that you've already run in your case as well.
Yeah, like it'll just be looking at why your solution is better. But the important point is the way you structure it when you're going through each of their points, when you're looking at the arguments they've made and you're rebutting them because they're completely wrong, is it shows that you've said, here are reasons why it wouldn't work. But in the next breath you're saying, even if it could work, here's why it's not a good thing. So the even if argument, even keeping it in the rebuttal section, keeping it as part of all of your rebuttal points, actually gives you a nice flow and a comprehensive way of tackling their positive.
And the reason it's significant, or it's a good skill to have, I'll get to you in just a sec. The reason it's important to have is because even if you don't buy what your opposition has said, sometimes your adjudicator does, right? Sadly, your opposition can actually be persuasive. So, with that in mind, you need to be able to do more than just say, no, it's not going to happen. Like, no, the things you've said are not true. Like, we don't believe any of that. You're just complete liars. because your adjudicator might not think that. So once you go through, we don't think that's true, but even if it was, here, Mr. or Madam Adjudicator, the reasons why what they've said are worse than what we think, or like here is some extra analysis just to prove more and dissuade what they've said from your money. Yes?
So is it okay to say this is why the opposing team's points are wrong, as well as say even if it does happen, so it's okay to say both?
Yeah, so the beauty of the even if argument is that it doesn't say you accept what they believe. You're not conceding anything to your opposition. You're just saying, even if we believed it, right, here's why it's not better. And so it basically says if the adjudicator bought the premise, then they shouldn't buy the outcomes.
It's a classic law thing, right, by saying, let's pretend that what I have just said was wrong, and I'll argue something else just to cover all my bases, but let's pretend that it was wrong. And you don't have to actually admit that what you have said might not work, might not be true, or might be completely crazy, but you get to run multiple arguments without sounding inconsistent.
So you might say in the argument of, someone says to you, legalizing drugs will cause more people to take drugs, and I realise my poor spelling/grammar in that particular sentence will forever be captured on video. But if they say that if you legalise drugs, more people are going to take drugs, and you've said, well, here are the reasons why they won't, you could say, even if that was true, the ways in which people will take those drugs under our system will be safer. Because if the government has legalised it, there's less stigma attached to it. They don't have to go into some back alley and shoot heroin into their eyeballs, right? They can actually get safe injecting rooms, like they can have safe needles. They can use, there'll be the way in which they take that particular drug will be safer. So it won't be that you won't have the harms that you get from taking drugs when it's banned. You'll actually have a safer system. So that might be a way of just disputing the negative outcomes that the opposition has said. Oh, that last point is just to say, if you're versing a really good team, and you can't think of that many reasons why the arguments are wrong, just use the even if argument to kind of reduce why what they said would happen. Broader tactics. Alright. This is the last section. So we've gone through case construction, gone through first principles, looking at the crush, looking at ideas of logic. Broader tactics. When you're establishing the context as an affirmative, you can use a couple of things. In fact, 3 things. You can use trends, norms, and tipping points, right? The idea of a trend is to say, what we are proposing is the next step in a progressive series of steps that have already happened, that we think this is the next logical one to occur. This is the next step to say, say we were talking about, if you were talking about, say, allowing, if you're allowing women into positions of like being priests and rabbis, right? You might say that the context is that we've broken down all other barriers in society that restrict where you can work and restrict inequality in the workplace, discrimination based on who you are at birth. We think this is the next logical step to actually break into long-standing beliefs of religion, right? That might be the trend that you set up. And what that does is it shows that what you're proposing, even though it might appear radical initially, might actually not be that radical. It might be something that society has been moving towards, and that reduces the burden you have to prove why such a drastic change may actually not be so drastic. The next thing is a norm. This is just the idea of dealing with that society has specific norms, and you might want to make a change that actually complies with it, or you might want to make a change that actually starts to create a new norm. So we all know that, hopefully, government legislation leads to changes in norms over time. For example, if you legalise drugs, maybe the norm would be that taking drugs isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, or that having safe and injecting centres is not the worst thing in the world. So you might establish that we want to, in your case, the reason we're the affirmative making a change is that we want to establish a specific norm, or the norms mean that what we're going to propose should occur. The final one is tipping points. And this is often, say, classically used in intervention debates, where you basically set up a context to say, so much has happened to this point, we need to act now because we are at a tipping point. We need to act now because if we don't, the consequences will be dire. Or if we don't, we can't act in the future in the same way, right? Does anyone know of a classic debate which might, besides intervention, which might use a tipping point? Yeah? Yeah, we need to act now because if we act in the future, any actions that we take will be useless, right? Because the warming will have happened, or because there'll be too much carbon in the atmosphere for us to deal with. Yeah. Oh, you want to explain that?
Oh, fat kids, this is what I said. It's people, this is, I guess it ties to the trend, that there's a trend where children are becoming more and more obese, and there's a point at which you can't, like, it becomes much more difficult to undo that. So you say there's a tipping point where now we should act to, like, prevent more children getting fat, because once they get too fat to become fat adults, like, statistically, they were more likely to have children who themselves are obese, and that becomes a lot more problematic.
And that there's been debate topics where we would remove obese children from their parents, right? Put them into, say, state care, where they can actually start to deal with that, right? So that's an idea of we'll reach a tipping point, and at a certain point in that child's life, it's so once you pass that, it's so much harder to actually deal with that. So the context to establish at the affirmative is that we need to act now. Waiting will not be good enough. And that says to the opposition and to the adjudicator, status quo can't continue, right? If it continues, we lose.
And that's often an argument to get over some sort of big cost. So in a lot of climate change debates, people say, well, the cost of acting now is incredibly high. The cost of not doing things is problematic because we should wait 5 years because renewable energy will have moved on so much better, it'll be so much cheaper, blah blah blah. And it's often an argument to get around that by saying we can't wait 5 years for renewable energy to be cheap. We can't wait for X to happen because the consequences are completely dire.
Yeah. So this is one of the last, I'm fairly certain it's one of the last slides I have. I know it's a lot to take in. This document there's a big document on the MAD website you can go to, or I can explain more to you later. These are just some classic mistakes that are often made in debates that you guys should keep in mind when you're making an argument, when you're preparing a case, when you're getting ready to do a debate. The first one is a problem-solution gap. What that basically means is that the affirmative team or the negative team, doesn't really matter, whoever's proposing a model might establish a problem that exists and then propose a solution which actually doesn't fix the problem, that actually doesn't deal with the issues in the problem, that doesn't actually deal with the root causes of that problem, right? It doesn't actually ensure that the problem they set up will be fixed. You'll be surprised how many times people do that without actually realizing it. How many times people will say something's going to work without actually analyzing how it links back to the problem. And so, for example, one of the debates I did once was about police resources to track pedophiles online, right? That we should dedicate more and more more and more police resources to that issue. And the affirmative team said, I think we might have been the affirmative team as well, basically said that the issue of pedophilia is so abhorrent, it's so awful, that we actually need to dedicate as many resources to this issue as we could. The problem that was pointed out to us was that vast majority of issues of children being assaulted actually don't occur online. They occur with people that they know. So the solution of throwing a bunch of resources to online tracking wouldn't actually really affect the problem that we established of assaulting children being awful, because we're only really dealing with such a marginal number of people that we're not going to change the problem. In fact, we might remove police resources from other particular areas that might be more harmful. But in that case, we had a problem, we didn't have a solution that was going to hit the core of that problem. The second one there is the fallacy of mutual exclusivity. It's a very kind of wanky way of saying, yeah, but why can't we do both things, right? Time and time again, you will have debaters get up and say the affirmative team says, we're going to have education as part of our plan. We're going to legalize drugs and we're going to have education about drugs and about using drugs and about why drugs are bad for you, so that it's going to be legal, but less people will use drugs because they'll know how awful it is to you, right? The negative team will get up and say, oh no, we want to ban drugs. We want drugs to remain illegal, but we're going to also have education. That's not mutually exclusive. We can do both, right? And here's why education works for us, blah, blah, blah. The thing with that, and the thing to keep in mind with something not being mutually exclusive, is that just because it can happen on both sides, doesn't mean it actually happens in the same way, right? So how do you think education might play out if drugs were legal? How do you think drug education might play out if drugs are legal in society? Well, actually, what do you guys think might be the difference between someone being educated on drugs when they're legal and someone being educated on drugs when they're illegal?
Well, when it's illegal and you're educated about it, you're aware of the drug and you feel like you want to test it out and experience it. Whereas if it's legal, then you're already aware of it and it's not that important anymore.
Yeah, to an extent. Yeah.
There's no stigma attached to getting that education?
Yeah, there's no stigma attached to it. So a teacher who is saying this is the effect of that particular drug doesn't then also have to say, and that's really bad and you shouldn't do it, and if you do it, you're going to hell, right? The idea that the education itself is actually different in the way it plays out. Did you?
Yeah, just to add to that, basically, like, if it's legal, they'll teach you how to use it, and if it's illegal, they'll teach you why it's bad to use it. So sort of that kind of difference as well.
And so that's something that debaters will often say, and it happens a lot with education, and it can happen with other like principles and other model aspects as well. They'll say, we can have education too, or we can do thing X just like the affirmative team can, therefore it's not mutually exclusive. And when they throw those words out at you, and you'll hopefully remember this, just think, okay, well, maybe it is mutually exclusive. If it is, tell them to shut up. But if not, would the same thing that both sides are talking about play out the same way under both sides? Would it actually have the same result? Would education be just as good in the affirmative and just as good in the negative? And if you can show why, even though they're not mutually exclusive, your education system might be better or would be different, it's actually really powerful analysis that the adjudicator can actually use to give your side credit, because you've shown why even both solutions, your solution is better. Push debating, or like burn pushing as it's often known in
Classic Sydney.
Yeah, is well, it's been quoted, so yes, classic Sydney. Is something that happens oftentimes with really aggressive teams. Now, that's not to say that being aggressive or being energetic in a debate is necessarily a bad thing, but the idea of push debating is to say, and it usually happens from the affirmative team, or from affirmative teams, where they say, here's what we support. What they have to support is X, Y, Z, right? What they have to support in this debate is blah. So if you're talking about drugs, we say we're going to legalize drug X, Y, Z. They have to support banning drugs. And what they're going to say is, here's why banning drugs are good. What that tries to do is it unfairly tries to say what the opposition should be doing, when that's not necessarily what they might do, right? They might choose to ban drugs. They might also choose to take a counter model or a soft line or something like that, right? So push debating is really, really, really annoying. If someone is trying to tell you what you should run and they're in the opposition, you can actually call them on that. You can say, no, we don't necessarily support what they told us we should, said we should support. Here's what we actually do. And it's, once you point it out, it's very clear the opposition is trying to bully you into a specific position they want you to be in, but may not necessarily be the one that you prepped, may not be the one that you want to run. The final thing, the final classic debating mistake is slippery slope arguments. And if anyone went through DAB in high school, you would have heard slippery slope arguments used a lot, and oftentimes they're not really logical. And I want to use one from a real debate. I think the best example is actually from Mean Girls, where he says, if you have sex, you will get pregnant and die, right? And the concept, the problems of slippery slope is that it's very difficult. Each time you go from one point to another down that slope, you actually need to do a lot more work in actually proving why each thing would happen, right? Why each step in the chain is actually going to lead, is going to happen. Slippery slopes are very difficult to prove because that takes a lot of work that people oftentimes don't actually put into it. It's very difficult to say going from one option, so going from having sex to getting pregnant, that might be realistic, but then dying is not necessarily the most realistic option. It's very difficult to prove that. And you'll find a lot of times as well, people will say it's a slippery slope, because once you go from blur, you go to blur, and you go to blur. They don't actually analyse why those things are likely to happen, if they're equally as likely to happen, if they could actually happen in reality, even if, whether or not they will happen.
I was going to say, slippery slopes aren't usually used at university debating. It would be very rare that you come across them because they take quite a lot of time to prove, and no one really wants to waste their time, like all 8 minutes of a speech on one particular slippery slope argument, because the reality is, a lot of the time, they're not that convincing. So, slippery slope is this doomsday scenario will happen. Future predicting is not a completely complete science, and so most people are just like, well, we don't think it's going to happen. Moving right along, at which point your 8-minute speech has been completely thrown out the window. And so it's rare that you'll get a slippery slope argument, and if you want to run one, think very carefully about how important it is to actual case to prove that this doomsday scenario will actually happen, because you're going to spend a lot of time dealing with it and a lot of time having to defend it further on down the speeches.
And it just goes back to what we talked about in first principles. Is it logical? Does it fit with the principles and the clash of the debate? Can they actually prove what happened? Or is it just an idea, just an assertion that they're throwing out that's not necessarily provable? Okay, so that's the So what we've covered today is there's a fair bit of material there. Looking at case construction and hard and soft ones, looking at first principles, and then looking at some classic mistakes. Does anyone have any questions?